Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if there's such a thing as dark intelligence. So specifically, dark emotional intelligence. So this would be a type of emotional intelligence possessed by somebody who has dark triad traits. Now, another question I've had that's related to this is, what is the relationship between the dark triad and emotional intelligence? So I'll start with emotional intelligence and then talk about the dark triad and then look at the relationship between these constructs and, of course, ultimately answer this question, is dark intelligence really something that exists? So the term emotional intelligence was coined in 1990, and back then it was really the ability to deal with emotions. It was made popular in a book in 1995. That's when it really kind of exploded in terms of popularity. And now we have it in a few different forms, right? It has several definitions. Generally, emotional intelligence is the ability to receive, decode, and accurately interpret emotional and social information from oneself and from others. So internally and externally. Now, there have been several different conceptualizations of emotional intelligence as well. For example, we see these models that refer to it as a skill, so something that's learned. Other models say it's really a trait, like a personality trait, and still others say it's a mixture of both. Mostly, emotional intelligence is thought of as positive. High emotional intelligence is tied to being more successful in your career, greater life satisfaction, better mental health and better physical health, improved relationships, and less violence. We see that research has repeatedly demonstrated that emotional intelligence is associated with pro-social behavior. But even with all these positive outcomes tied to emotional intelligence, we see this idea that there must be a dark side to it. Again, the so-called dark intelligence. So the word dark here really means dysfunctional or maladaptive, just like the way we see it used in the dark triad. So essentially, with dark intelligence, we would see the emotional manipulation piece. So using emotional intelligence to manage other people's emotions to achieve a desired outcome. So now taking a look at the dark triad. So I covered emotional intelligence. We'll take a look at the dark triad traits. So the dark triad has 3 traits, and they're considered subclinical. So they don't necessarily require mental health treatment. Rather, they're traits that are quite common and they can occur in a large number of people. So the 3 traits of the dark triad are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Now, all 3 of these traits have their own traits, but in the dark triad put together they share certain traits, like being callous, manipulative, having a lack of empathy, having low agreeableness, and for most of the time having low neuroticism. Now, looking specifically at each one, we see that narcissism is characterized by a grandiose sense of self, arrogance, devaluing other people, and a sense of entitlement, and of course a few other things. Psychopathy contains, among other things, antisocial behavior, thrill-seeking, impulsivity, irresponsibility, and deception. It's considered the darkest of the dark triad traits. Then we have Machiavellianism. With this trait, people tend to be cynical, pragmatic, they have good impulse control, and they're strategic. But of course the overall goal is still manipulation with Machiavellianism. So we see those are the dark triad traits. Are people with these traits emotionally intelligent? So this would be an important question to answer on this road to answer the question about dark intelligence. Well, we see in the research literature mixed findings. We see both positive and negative associations between narcissism and emotional intelligence. And of course, at the same time, we see narcissism characterized by low empathy, as I mentioned. We see that psychopathy has been both positively and negatively related to emotional intelligence, and there we also have that lack of empathy. And we see Machiavellianism is pretty much consistently negatively correlated with emotional intelligence. But of course, what's weird here is that these people tend to have interpersonal skills that allow them to successfully manipulate other people. So the research findings and how we look at each of their characteristics don't really quite line up. I mean, in one sense, of course, they do, like I said, the lack of empathy. But in another sense, the abilities of people with dark triad traits seem to have an emotional intelligence component to them. that's not explained in our understanding of the traits or in our understanding of emotional intelligence. So in the research literature, we see this one specific study that looks at dark intelligence. There are, of course, several, but I'm looking at one here. I use some other articles as well. I'll put the references to all of these articles in the description for this video. But in this one particular article, we see that they were really looking at the dark triad and emotional intelligence interactions, right? So did dark triad traits and emotional intelligence interact in some way that would predict emotional manipulation? So combinations of dark triad traits and domains of emotional intelligence that would be linked to somebody attempting to manipulate somebody's emotions. Again, that's what they were really examining in this study. And they looked at emotional intelligence in 3 different domains. Emotional expressivity. This is accurately expressing and communicating emotional states, for example, having expressive eyes. Emotional sensitivity, receiving and interpreting others' emotions, for example, being described as a sensitive or understanding person. And emotional control. This is regulating emotional displays, for example, keeping a calm exterior. And what they found here is there was a positive association between narcissism and emotional intelligence, but there was mixed associations with psychopathy and a negative association with Machiavellianism. Now, I think what's even more interesting here is they found that both narcissism and psychopathy moderated the link between emotional control and emotional manipulation. So what does this mean? Well, moderation is when a variable explains the strength or direction in the relationship between 2 other variables. So here in this specific situation, the more narcissism and psychopathy, the higher the levels, the stronger the association between emotional control and manipulation. So higher levels of narcissism and psychopathy mean that emotional control will better predict emotional manipulation. So it's a fairly interesting finding around this area of dark intelligence. Now, as I was reading this study, one thing that occurred to me around this emotional control finding was, are they really measuring emotional control, or are they measuring, in a sense, neuroticism? Right now, the measurements used, of course, were designed to measure emotional control, but there seems like a lot of overlap. And what I mean by this is someone who is controlling their emotions looks just like somebody who doesn't have emotional reactivity. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. So, kind of putting this all together, what does this all mean? Is there such a thing as dark intelligence? So, essentially, again, this would be a type of emotional intelligence only possessed or primarily possessed by people with dark triad traits. Emotional intelligence that's used in a maladaptive or dysfunctional way. Well, of course, in the research literature, we have mixed findings here, but when looking at all the research together, or at least a good deal of it, I think essentially the answer here is no. There is not a dark version of emotional intelligence, or even a dark use of emotional intelligence. Now, this may seem a little unusual. Again, we talked about how people with dark triad traits know how to manipulate. They seem to have an ability to interpret emotions and understand them and act on them appropriately. But here are my thoughts on this. There are people that do not have emotional intelligence, but they understand that it exists. They understand that other people have it. They understand that if they can appear to be emotionally intelligent, then that would be favorable in terms of their own efforts to manipulate other people. So there are people who fake having emotional intelligence, but that's not the same thing as dark intelligence. Meaning that's not really an ability used to harm. It's pretending to have an ability and then harming people. And also, if we look at this low neuroticism question, low neuroticism isn't the same thing as emotional control, although they appear similar. They might be measured in the same way. So there's an emotional control portion to emotional intelligence, but that's not low neuroticism. So low neuroticism is a lack of reactivity to stimuli that would normally elicit emotions. So somebody who has low neuroticism doesn't get angry too easily. They also don't get depressed or anxious too easily. They're usually described as calm, cool, and collected. Someone with low neuroticism does not demonstrate emotional control. Rather, they demonstrate an absence of reactivity. For them, there is nothing to control. They don't feel an internal struggle. When somebody's emotionally intelligent, they have to work to control their own emotions. They feel it. They feel the emotions coming up, and they want to react, but they exercise control. When somebody's low in neuroticism, like we see much of the time with the dark triad traits, that's not what's happening. For someone who has the dark traits, what appears to be emotional control is really just an automatic process. Again, there aren't emotions there in the first place. Control is an active process. What's more, many of those who have interacted at a clinical level with people who have dark triad traits, and a lot of people who have just interacted with them at all, notice that people with dark personalities do not appear to have a lot of depth and sensitivity, but they can still be charming. This is actually one of the characteristics of both narcissism and psychopathy, a superficial charm. Now, this isn't an evil, dark, or bad charm. It's a superficial charm, and that means it's not really a charm at all. It's artificially maintained for a short period of time. They can appear charming. It's like if you have a model airplane that has a motor in it and another model airplane that doesn't, and you go to the roof of a house and you throw each of them off. For a short period of time, they both appear to be flying, but the one without the motor is going to hit the ground. So that's not really what we mean by flying. It was really falling all along. Similarly, superficial charm seems like charm, but it isn't really. The sensitivity, connectedness, caring, and emotions that characterize what we think of as charm are not really there. So again, in my opinion, there's no such thing as dark intelligence or dark emotional intelligence. Those with dark personalities can appear to have affective empathy by compensating with cognitive empathy, meaning they really can't feel like other people feel. We also call affective empathy sympathy. So they can't have sympathy, but they can have cognitive empathy. They can understand how people feel. Sometimes we just call this empathy, so it gets a little confusing. But essentially what they're doing, again, is using their empathy to compensate for the lack of sympathy. So that's not the same thing as dark intelligence. The idea of dark intelligence suggests the existence of a special ability. But what we actually see here is the lack of an ability, specifically a lack of affective empathy or sympathy. So in a time when it's become popular to want to build onto the research of the dark triad, for example, the dark tetrad, which adds subclinical sadism to the dark triad, this dark intelligence research seems like it's going that direction, right? We're adding, again, one more thing to the dark personality. But in this case, I don't think this is actually supported by evidence. I don't believe there is actually dark intelligence. And again, as I mentioned before, emotional intelligence is characterized as being prosocial, right? It's positive. And it doesn't really seem to have a negative version to it that we know of right now. So I know whenever I talk about topics like the dark triad and emotional intelligence, there'll be a variety of opinions, people who agree with me and disagree with me, and have other experiences with these constructs. Please put those opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of dark intelligence to be interesting. Thanks for watching.